welcome to Chess Beauty number 92. And this is a study by Van Essen. I believe he's a contemporary Dutch problemist and study composer. And this was a second place prize winner in the Humor Tourney of 2004. A very interesting study problem tournament, which we've already actually looked at a few other positions from this tournament in previous Chess Beauties. And actually, I wish I had more than just the prize winners from that tournament. Uh, because I'm sure there was some entertaining stuff there. Anyway, this is something of a magnum opus, and once you see the solution to this, you'll scratch your head in amazement at how somebody could think of something like this. At least I did. Okay, so you might want to start trying to solve it on your own. Good luck. um, the stipulation is white to play and win. Now, at the present moment, he's white is down an exchange and a pawn, I believe. Anyway, it's a roughly equivalent material, but there's a couple of unusual features in the position, as you can see. The rooks are kind of in a funny position, the black rooks, and the bishop is hemmed in on the black side. On the white side, the rook is on prise on e5, as the bishop is on f3. So the material parity doesn't look like it's destined to last very long. Also, the pawn is on prise on h4. Anyway, there's kind of a lot going on in this position. So anyway, take a look at it, and we'll come right back and discuss the solution. Okay, so this is a complicated problem. It's let's take a quick look at some of the non-critical lines here. So, you would think that white would want to preserve his rook. So if he plays, say, for instance, rook to e8, then knight to d6 with a fork, but he can't actually take that rook right now. After king to b6, if he takes the rook, then bishop c5 is checkmate. So that's something that he wants to avoid, so he does this instead. And now rook to b8, threatening some sort of discovery by the king, I guess. D takes e3, a6, and now we're threatening to maybe queen something else. And bishop takes c4, uncovering a defense of the rook on the back rank there. So lots of clever play in the side variations. a3 check, and we'll just look at the main variation here. King takes a3, a7, with a very nasty looking queen coming. And anyway, the queening doesn't work. However, I won't go into that variation. If the queen takes, then king takes b2, rook takes h8, and black really wins in this position. So anyway, here knight to c4 check is logical. Knight takes c4, pawn takes pawn, rook takes rook, pawn takes rook becomes queen. And now black is going to queen himself. Knight takes knight to b5 check. C takes b5. So many sacrifices. C takes b5. Queen to f4 to guard against the queen. E takes d2, and he can't do both. E3 check. King to a4 exclam. And now queen to d3, trying to keep a lid on things. After rook to h4, the best white has is queen takes d2, f pawn becomes queen, queen to a2, and then we have a perpetual as the best that that white can hope for. So that's just a quick side variation. There are a number of other variations in that line that we just looked at after rook to e8, but I don't want to make this a 30-minute video about one position, so we'll go on. Okay, so the actual solution involves bishop to c5 check, starting with a sacrifice. So you'll see white's material gradually gets eaten away as this problem continues. So Now it's a forced mate in 22. I'm surprised you didn't notice that off the top of your head before. Okay, so he only has two choices here. He can take the bishop, which seems logical. If somehow he wants to avoid this, he can play, he can play king takes a5. But then the surprising move a3, and then knight to d8. Check is the best that black has. King to a7, and it doesn't matter what black plays here. Bishop to b4 is unstoppable, and that is checkmate. So going back to the position after bishop takes c5, we realize the king has to take on c5. Now d4 check, another sacrifice. King takes d4. If he tried something else here after king takes c5, d4 check. If he tries king to b4, then rook to e3, d takes c4, e3 check, king takes a5, knight takes c4 check, king to a4, knight to d1, checkmate. And alternatively, after king to c5, d4 check, you can play d6, but that leads to immediate mate, c5 check. So you can see after king takes c5, d4 check, he only has king to d4. And now knight to b5 check begins a mad chase with the knights. Now, first of all, the knight cannot be taken. C takes b5, rook takes d5 check. So that's no good. King to c5 is not any good either. d4 check, king to b4, rook to e3 exclam, d takes c4, king to b6 exclam, c takes b5, and a3 is checkmate. Very sneaky checkmate. Okay, so we can see that black, after knight to b5 check, doesn't have very many options. He must take the rook, which of course is the most attractive looking move anyway. Now, I should mention that the computer thinks that black is thoroughly winning by a huge margin in this problem, and only it takes it quite a while before it figures out that that black is in serious trouble. So after king takes e5, we have knight to d3, and now we have a bunch of only moves. King takes f5, only move. Knight to d4 check. King to g6, only move. Knight to f4, only move is g7. Well, it's not quite the only move. He does have king to h6, but then knight to f5 is checkmate. So after knight to f4 check, he has to go to g7, and now knight to f5 check, king f8, only move, knight to g6 check, only move, king to e8, and now after the brilliant move, king to c8, black is in virtual zugzwang. The king and the bishop have no moves. If the knight moves, then knight to d6 is mate. Any move of the rook on h7 allows knight to g7, checkmate. So black only has pawn moves, and all the pawn moves except one lead to immediate mate. So for instance, if he plays a6 here, excuse me, wait a minute, hang on a second. After a rook to b6, he has to play g takes f3. So let's look at some of the alternatives. Let's look at the other pawn moves. You can see, well, actually, I'll just show you one of the pawn moves because they're all really joined by a common theme. So say if c5, then bishop to c4. Excuse me, bishop takes g4, my apologies, d4 or whatever, knight to g7 check, and now rook takes g7 is forced, and now bishop takes d7 is mate. So any of those other pawn moves will lead to a very similar, directly identical finish. So going back to the position before, excuse me, after king to c8. He also has could try to free his rooks with knight to h5, but that of course this allows the knight to g7 mate, as previously mentioned. So back to the position after king to c8, and now white plays a6. Very calm move. In fact, this is such a crazy puzzle because it started off with a bunch of sacrifices, and now we have a white move. Excuse me, a quiet move by the white king, that king to c8, and now a very patient moving the pawn up the board here. So um, black only has pawn moves now. White's pieces are ideally placed, even though he's down 2 rooks at this point. So f2 is black's best shot. If he tries, say, d4 instead, then a7, f2, a8 promotes to a knight. The queen promotes, but knight to c7 is checkmate. So it's kind of one of the main threats in the position. Again, if he tries, if we go back a move or two, after a6, he can try, say, for instance, d6. But this leaves a7, f2, a8 becomes queen this time. Queening again on f1, but then queen takes c6 is checkmate. So again, back to the position after a6, and now f2 is black's best shot, although it's not enough to save him. So we continue our journey. A7, black queens, white queens. Well, he doesn't queen. He underpromotes, so a knight. So now we have 3 knights on the board. So obviously the threat here is knight to c7 checkmate, and so we only have a 1 square to prevent mate, which is queen to f4. And this is the first time where the computer realizes that black is losing. So all up to this point, the computer, which is Komodo I was using, was showing a 9-point or somewhere in that range, 7 to 9-point material advantage for black. Now all of a sudden, it can finally see the checkmate here. So it took a while. So now white plays knight to c7 check anyway. And of course, I should go back up a little bit. You would think the tempting move, knight takes f4, but after e5, knight to e5, black can untangle, and he's actually winning this position. So taking the queen would be a big mistake. So going back after queen to f4, knight to c7 check, and of course the only way to stop mate is to give up the queen, which he does. And now black is in another semi-zugzwang state, and he only has pawn moves available for the reasons we stated earlier. All piece moves lead to checkmate. So after king takes c7, well, he could try something like c5, c takes d5, c4, a4, c3, d takes c3, d6, king to c8, and now black is in complete zugzwang. He's got no more pawn moves. That means that any piece move is going to result in a checkmate. If the knight moves, then knight to d6 is checkmate. If the rook moves, which is the only other piece it can move, then knight to g7 is checkmate. It's a very interesting position. So let's go back here after king takes c7, d takes c4 is black's best shot, and now d5, excuse me, a4, then d5, and then getting out of any knight discoveries. Very clever move. Another quiet move from white. d4, a5, c3, a6, c takes d2, and black must be getting excited. the thought of getting another queen. A7, D1 queen, A8 knight, of course, and now the black queen is utterly helpless to stop mate, and he only tries one weak attempt, knight to E5, but that doesn't work because of knight to D6 is checkmate. So an amazing position by an amazing study by Van Essen, and very, very funny. Let me just we'll go through the main moves very quickly. So starting with bishop takes c5, we'll look at the how this goes. Sacrificing the rook, chasing the king all over Hell's creation, and now this brilliant king move, putting black in zugzwang and forcing pawn moves, forcing him to queen, and finally white wins this in very tidy fashion. So there are a lot more variations in this, but as I said, I was trying to keep this down to a reasonable length. Even so, it's coming on like 17 minutes. So I hope you'll join me for Chess Beauty 93, which will be a position by another Dutch composer. So thank you for watching. Bye bye.